One wrong turn, a road nobody should have taken, and by the time the van stopped sliding, 6 strangers understood nobody was coming to help them out here. The snow had buried it for years, but the second she brushed it clean, she knew the road they were on wasn't the road anyone thought it was. The river was on their right this morning. Now it was on the left. She said it out loud, and the whole van went dead quiet. The way back had been right there. Then, in a few seconds, it wasn't. No road behind them now, and none anyone trusted ahead. 1 bar. For half a second, 1 bar. Then nothing, and that's when it really hit them. Out here, no one even knew where to look. For hours, the old man hadn't said a word. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, and whatever he'd been holding on to all this time, he was finally ready to show her. The thing about being lost is, it doesn't feel like anything at first. No alarm, no warning. Just a road and trees and a quiet that goes on a little too long. Nora was 20, a college student heading home for the break, riding in a battered old van full of strangers. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. Not yet. But she'd already noticed something, and she couldn't unnotice it. Later, when the road turned bad and the sky went dark, she'd get down on her knees in the snow and dig at something half buried by the side of the road. An old metal sign, an arrow pointing the way the road used to go, and it pointed the wrong way. That's when she'd know for sure. But let's back up. Because to understand how 5 strangers ended up trusting a 20-year-old they'd just met, you have to start that morning. It started so normal. A little town, a cold, clear morning. The kind of local van that runs people up and down the valley for a few coins. Nora climbed in, found a seat, pulled her hood up against the cold. Just wanted to get home. There were 5 others aboard. She didn't know a single one of them yet. In a few hours, she'd trust them with her life. And they'd trust her right back. The girl next to her was easy to talk to. Studying to be a nurse, warm smile, offered Nora half a granola bar before they'd even swapped names. Behind them sat an old man. Quiet, kept to himself. He had a little flower in his lap, wrapped in paper, and he held on to it like it mattered. Nobody asked why. You don't with strangers. But Nora noticed. She noticed most things. That was kind of the problem. Then, about an hour in, the van slowed. Stopped. Up ahead, the bridge was closed. A barrier across the road, a couple of tired warning signs, nobody around. The driver climbed out to have a look. Decent guy. Careful. You could tell he took the job seriously. He stood there a while, hands on his hips, staring at that barrier like it might move if he waited long enough. It didn't. There was only one other way through. The driver spread a map out on the wheel. Old paper, soft at the folds. He was frowning at it when one of the passengers leaned up between the seats. A woman, maybe 30. Short hair, the outdoorsy type. She tapped the map with 2 fingers. "There's the old road," she said. "I grew up around here. It cuts back down to the valley." She sounded sure, really sure. And when someone sounds that sure, people listen. So they took it. The turn came up fast, a narrow little road peeling off the main one, trees leaning in close on both sides. Down here it wasn't bad yet. Just old snow tucked under the trees, the valley still soft and pale behind them. Nobody was worried. Why would they be? A local knew a shortcut. That's the kind of thing that saves you 20 minutes. Or the kind that costs you everything. For a while, it was almost nice. The youngest one, this kid with headphones and a nervous energy, put on some music, and people actually loosened up. Somebody laughed. The old man just sat there with his flower, straightening the paper around it. Quiet as ever. Nora watched him do it. There was something careful in the way he held it. Like it was the only thing in the world he had left to be careful with. And then, slowly, the light started to change. You don't always notice it happening. The clouds just lower themselves, get heavier, the kind of gray that sits right on top of the trees and follows you. There was more snow on the road now, not much, but more than before. The music was still playing inside. Nobody else was looking out the window. Nobody except Nora. And what she saw, she didn't like. The river. That was the first thing. When they'd set out that morning, the river ran along the right side of the road. She remembered it clearly. She'd been watching it sparkle. But now it was on the left. She sat up a little, blinked, tried to talk herself out of it. Maybe the road curved. Maybe she'd misremembered. But Nora didn't misremember things like that. And the little cold feeling in her chest, that wasn't going away. So she did what any of us would do. She pulled out her phone, checked the map. And that's when the second thing happened. No signal, not one bar. The little map on her screen was just frozen, stuck on the last thing it had loaded, God knows how long ago. She held it up near the window. Nothing. Tilted it toward the front. Still nothing. Now, a frozen map isn't proof of anything, right? Phones lose signal in the mountains all the time. That's normal. She told herself that. She really did try to tell herself that. But here's the thing about Nora. Once she noticed one thing that didn't add up, she couldn't stop noticing. The river on the wrong side. The dead phone. Two little wrong things. And two wrong things have a way of becoming three. She went up front, crouched down by the driver, kept her voice low so she wouldn't spook anyone. "I think we might be going the wrong way," she said. And to his credit, he didn't brush her off. He was a good guy, this driver. Patient. He just glanced at her and said, real gentle, "The lady in back grew up here. She knows the road." Which was fair. Totally fair. Why would he trust a 20-year-old he'd met that morning over a local who swore she knew every turn? Nora nodded. Sat back down. Because what was she supposed to say? "Trust me, I've got a feeling." No. Feelings weren't enough. She knew that. If she was going to convince anybody of anything, she needed more than a hunch. She needed something you could point at. Something real. So she started watching. Harder than before. The local woman heard them talking. Of course she did. And she didn't love it. "I grew up on this road," she said. And there was an edge in it now. "I've walked it 100 times. And you know what?" Nora believed her. That was the strange part. This woman wasn't lying. She wasn't trying to trick anybody. She genuinely, completely believed she was right. Which somehow made it worse. Because how do you argue with someone who's certain? You can't just say, "You're wrong." Not without proof. So Nora didn't fight her. She just filed it away. Quiet. The woman knew this area. Nora didn't doubt that for a second. But knowing a place and knowing you took the right fork 2 miles back, those aren't the same thing. And somewhere back there, at some split in the road, one of them had been wrong. Then the road changed under them. You could feel it before you could see it. The smooth hum of asphalt turned into something rougher. Gravel, then barely even that. The van slowed way down, tires crunching, and the trees pressed in tighter on both sides. This wasn't a shortcut anymore. Shortcuts are paved. Shortcuts have signs. This was just a track. The kind loggers use, or nobody uses at all. And the snow was getting deeper. Not a storm yet, just a steady, quiet thickening on the ground, filling in the ruts ahead of them. Inside the van, the music had stopped. Nobody remembered turning it off. It had just stopped somewhere back there, and nobody put it back on. That's usually how you know things have shifted. When the small comforts go quiet, and nobody says why. The first real snowflakes hit the glass around then. Fat ones, slow, the kind that mean business. And Nora noticed the old man do something. He looked up at that heavy sky, and then down at the flower in his hands. Just for a second. Then he did it again. Up at the sky, down at the flower, like he was doing math in his head. Like the two things were connected somehow, and the answer was running out. He caught her watching, gave her the smallest nod, didn't say a word. And Nora suddenly understood something she couldn't have explained. Wherever this old man was going, he needed to get there. Not wanted to, needed to. That flower wasn't decoration. It was a promise. And promises have a clock on them, even when nobody says so out loud. And then Nora got her third thing, the one you can point at. It was a stone, one of those old distance markers by the side of the road, worn down, half buried, the kind nobody even looks at anymore. But Nora looked. She'd passed one a few minutes back and clocked the number carved into it. Now here was another, and the number was bigger. Bigger. Think about what that means for a second. Those markers count the distance to somewhere. If you're driving toward a place, the numbers go down. 5, 4, 3, 2. You're getting closer. But these numbers were going up, which meant they weren't driving toward the valley at all. They were driving away from it. Every minute, every mile, further from where they wanted to be. That was it. That was the proof. Not a feeling, not a hunch. A number carved in stone that any single person on that van could walk over and read with their own eyes. The river, the phone, the road going bad. She could have been wrong about all of it. But not this. This was math. And here's what I love about Nora. She didn't panic. She didn't burst into tears or start yelling. She just sat there for a moment, let the cold certainty settle in, and thought, okay, now I can prove it. Now they'll have to listen. So she stood up. Right there in the middle of the van, this 20-year-old kid in a red hoodie. And she said it plain. No drama, just the facts, laid out so nobody could wave them away. The river was on our right this morning. It's on the left now. She let that sit. And the markers are going up. We're driving away from the valley, not toward it. And then the strangest thing happened. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. 5 people sat there and did the arithmetic in their own heads. Not one of them liked the answer. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. The local woman opened her mouth and closed it again. Because that's the thing about a fact. You can argue with a feeling all day long. But a number? 2 numbers, one bigger than the other? There's no arguing with that. The old man was the first to react. He didn't speak. He just looked at Nora, really looked at her, with something new in his eyes. Like he'd been thinking the exact same thing for the last hour and hadn't dared to say it. Like she'd just given him permission. The van rolled on for a few more seconds in total silence. And then the driver hit the brakes. They pulled into a wide bend, one of those spots where the road opens up just enough to stop. and a few of them climbed out into the snow to figure it out. And look, it wasn't a shouting match. I want to be clear about that. These were reasonable people in an unreasonable situation. But it was tense. The local woman was shaken now. She kept saying, "I don't understand. I know this road." And you could hear it. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was scared. Scared that she'd led everyone wrong. The driver was doing the math out loud. How far they'd come, how much daylight was left, whether they had the fuel to backtrack all that way. And Nora just stood there in the cold, snow catching in her hair, and let them work through it. She'd said her piece. She didn't need to win. She needed them safe. It's a different thing. You could see the exact moment it landed for the driver. His shoulders dropped. He looked back the way they'd come, all those miles of wrong road, and he made the call. "We turn around," he said. "Now, while we still can." Simple. Right. The only choice, really. And if they'd been 30 seconds faster, it might even have worked. The local woman had the map out, trying to work out where exactly they'd gone wrong, which fork had betrayed them. And then the wind did the cruelest little thing. A gust came down the slope, sharp and sudden, and tore the map right out of her hands. She grabbed for it, missed, and they all just watched it go. This pale square of paper, tumbling up and away into the gray, gone in about 2 seconds flat. Now, on paper, no pun intended. Losing a map you can't read anyway shouldn't matter much. But it did something to the mood. It felt like the mountain was taking things now. First the signal, then the road, now the map, snatched right out of her hands. The woman just stood there staring at the empty air where it had been. And quietly, almost to herself, she said the thing everyone was thinking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Nobody answered her. Not because they were angry, but because nobody knew what to say. Sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't turn the van around any faster. And Nora, watching her, felt this unexpected stab of pity. Because being wrong when you were only trying to help, that's its own kind of awful. Back in the van, the driver did one last check before turning around. His eyes went to the fuel gauge, and they stayed there a beat too long. Now, he didn't announce the number. Didn't need to. Nora saw his face, and that was enough. They'd burned a lot getting up here, backtracking all those miles they'd just climbed. It was going to be close, real close. But there was no other option, and he knew it. Better to run low heading the right direction than to keep pouring fuel into the wrong one. So he made the turn, cranked the wheel, eased the van around in that narrow space, inch by careful inch, until they were finally pointed back the way they'd come. And for one moment, one genuinely hopeful moment, it felt like the worst was behind them. They'd caught the mistake. They'd turned around. They were heading home. Nora let herself breathe. The old man closed his eyes. Even the local woman looked a little less haunted. They were going to be okay. That's what the moment felt like. And I wish I could tell you that's how it went. That they drove back down, warmed up, laughed about it later. But the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. Not even close. While the driver got the van turned around, the kid, the one with the headphones, had an idea. If they couldn't get signal down on the road, maybe higher up. So he scrambled up this little rocky rise beside the track, phone stretched up over his head, turning in slow circles like everybody does when they're desperate for one bar. And for a second, One cruel little second, it worked. A single bar flickered onto his screen. You should have seen his face. He lit up, started waving, yelling down to the others, "I've got it! I've got some..." And then it was gone. Just like that. The bar vanished, and the little loading circle started spinning again, around and around, going nowhere. He tried moving, tried holding it higher, climbed up another few feet on the rocks. Nothing. Whatever ghost of a signal had drifted through was long gone. And that's when it really sank in for all of them, not just Nora now, but everyone. They were properly cut off. No map, no phone, no way to call for help, no way to tell anyone where they were, because the truth was, they didn't even know where they were. That's the part that gets you. It's not just that nobody was coming. It's that nobody could come, because nobody knew to look. The kid climbed back down, quiet now, not saying anything. Slipped his dead phone into his pocket, and you could feel the whole group settle into something heavier. This wasn't an inconvenience anymore. This wasn't, "We'll laugh about this later." The light was starting to go. The snow was still falling. And 6 people were standing on a road that wasn't on any map they had. So they loaded back into the van, all of them, and started rolling, slow and careful, back down the way they'd come, back toward the valley, back toward home. And for a few minutes, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they'd caught a break. And then the mountain made its move. It started as a sound, low, deep, something you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The driver hit the brakes. Everyone went still. And up ahead, on the road they'd just been about to drive down, the slope let go. Rock and mud and old snow, all of it breaking loose at once, sliding down across the track in a slow, unstoppable wave. It didn't take 5 seconds. And when the dust settled, the way back was just gone, buried under a wall of rock taller than the van. Nobody said anything for a long moment. What was there to say? A minute earlier, and they'd have driven straight into it. A minute later, and they might have made it past. But instead, they were here, stopped, staring at a pile of stone where their road used to be. Behind them, a slide they couldn't move. Ahead of them, a wrong road going the wrong way, into higher country, into worse weather. There was no good direction left. Nora looked around at the others, the driver gripping the wheel, the local woman with her hand over her mouth, the old man silent in the back, holding his flower. And she understood that everything had just changed. This wasn't about finding the right road anymore. That option was gone. Now it was about one thing and one thing only: getting through the night. The driver tried to move them somewhere safer. Smart call. You don't want to sit right next to a fresh slide. There was a wider spot a little further along, off the main track, and he eased the van toward it, slow as he could. But the ice had other plans. Halfway across, the wheels lost their grip, and the van just slid. Not fast, not dramatic. Just this slow, sickening drift sideways that no amount of steering could stop. Nora grabbed the seat in front of her. Somebody gasped. The driver worked the wheel, calm as he could manage, and the van slid a few more feet and came to rest. Tilted, one wheel off the edge of the packed road, the whole thing leaning toward the drop. And then it stopped. Everyone froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, like the wrong shift of weight might send them the rest of the way. But it held. The van held. Slowly, carefully, the driver killed the engine, turned around, looked at his passengers and said very quietly, "Okay, Everybody okay?" And one by one they nodded, shaken. Cold, but okay. Nobody was hurt. That was the thing to hold on to. Nobody was hurt. But the van wasn't going anywhere now, not tilted like that, not on this ice, not in the dark. Trying to drive it would only make things worse. So that was it. That was the decision, made for them by the mountain. They weren't driving out tonight. They were going to have to sit tight, keep warm, keep it together, and wait for morning. 6 strangers, 1 broken-down van, and a whole long night of cold ahead of them. And that's usually when people fall apart. But that's not what happened here. Night came down fast up there. One minute it was gray dusk, the next it was just dark. Real dark. The kind you don't get in the city, where there's no street light, no glow on the horizon, nothing. Just the black shapes of trees and the endless soft hiss of snow. Inside the van, they did what they could. Killed everything they didn't need to save the battery. Kept one small light on. Dug through bags for anything warm, a spare scarf, a blanket somebody had packed, an extra jacket. They shared it all out. No arguing about it. In a strange way, the trouble had pulled them together instead of apart. The local woman, the one who'd led them wrong, she wasn't the enemy anymore. She was just cold and scared like everyone else. And somebody draped half a blanket over her shoulders, and she took it with a grateful, embarrassed little nod. The kid with the headphones handed round the last of somebody's snacks like it was a feast. And Nora sat there in the dim light, watching all of it, feeling this odd warmth in her chest despite the cold. Because here's the thing people forget about a crisis. It doesn't only bring out the worst in folks. Sometimes it brings out the best. Sometimes a bunch of strangers who'd never have said 2 words to each other end up sharing a blanket in the dark, looking out for each other. Because that's just what you do. But there was still one person who hadn't said much of anything. The old man. He sat in the back, that flower still cradled in his hands, staring out into the dark. And Nora had a feeling, a strong one, that he was about to break his silence. It was Nora he spoke to first. Maybe because she'd been watching him all day. Maybe because she was the one who'd noticed. He looked down at the flower in his hands, turned it over once, and he said very quietly, "She goes in this afternoon for an operation." He didn't have to say who. You could hear it in the way his voice cracked on the word. "I told her," he went on. "I told her she wouldn't wake up on her own, that I'd be right there." He'd been carrying that flower all day, across the whole valley, to be there when she opened her eyes. And instead, here he was, lost on a mountain in the dark, hours away, with a road buried behind him and no way through. Nora didn't say anything. She just let him talk. And then he told her the other thing, the thing he'd been holding on to even tighter than the flower. "I knew," he said, 2 hours ago. "I thought, that's not right. That turn's not right. I've driven these roads, years ago, but I've driven them." Nora leaned in. "Then why didn't you say something?" And the old man gave this small, sad shrug that just about broke her heart. "Because I'm 72, he said, "and I don't trust what I remember anymore." Who was going to listen to an old man's feeling? And there it was. That was the whole thing, wasn't it? He'd known, same as Nora had known. But where she'd gone looking for proof, he'd just gone quiet. Because somewhere along the way, the world had taught him his memory wasn't worth speaking up about. Nora looked at him for a long moment. And then she said the thing that would change everything. "Tell me what you remember. All of it. I'll listen. And so they got to work. The two of them. The old man, who knew these roads from decades ago, and the young woman, who noticed everything happening right now. His memory, her eyes. Put those two things together, and you've got something. He started talking, and Nora started listening. Really listening, the way almost nobody had listened to him in years. There was a marker, he said. An old iron sign, right about where we turned wrong. Pointed the way the road used to run before they built the new one. And Nora remembered that rusted thing she'd half noticed by the road hours ago. She grabbed a flashlight, pulled her hood up against the snow, and went looking. It took a while. The snow had buried most of it. But she found it, got down on her knees, and brushed the snow away with her bare hands until the shape came clear. An arrow, old and rusted, pointing off in a direction they hadn't gone. The old man came and crouched beside her, and when the light hit it, his eyes changed. Something woke up in him. Yes, he breathed. Yes, that's it. That's the old spur. And then it started pouring out of him, all the things his memory had been holding on to and afraid to say. There was a fork just past this sign. Not the way they'd come, the other way. And up that other way, if he was remembering right. And now, finally, he let himself believe he was. There was something that could save all of them. Nora looked at him. Remember what? And the old man smiled, for the first time all day. A shelter, he said. There used to be a shelter. They couldn't take the van. It was stuck and tilted, and the spur was too rough anyway. So the ones who could walk, walked. And here's where something happened that I really want you to notice. The local woman, the one who'd led them wrong, who'd been carrying that guilt all day like a stone in her chest. She stepped up, because it turned out that knowing this country still counted for something. She might have missed one fork in the dark, but she knew these slopes. Not that way, she said, when they started up the exposed side of the hill. The wind comes straight down that face. We go along the lower edge. There's cover. And she was right. She led them along the sheltered side, out of the worst of the wind, reading the land in the dark the way only someone who grew up there could. She spotted the old markers under the snow, little cairns, half buried, that marked the maintenance path. Without her, they'd have wandered right past them. And you could see what it did for her, to be useful again, to turn her mistake into something that mattered. She wasn't the woman who got them lost anymore. She was the woman getting them out. That's the thing about a wrong turn. It doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes the person who made the mistake is exactly the person who fixes it, if you just give them the chance. Nora walked beside her, and at one point the woman glanced over, and neither of them said anything. But something passed between them. Forgiveness, maybe, or just understanding. They kept walking up into the dark, toward whatever the old man remembered, and then, out of the dark, there it was. A little stone hut tucked back into the trees, exactly where the old man's memory said it would be. Now, they almost walked right past it. From the path, all you could see was blank wall, because the door didn't face the road. It faced the back slope, and it was the local woman who remembered why. The door's round the other side, she said. They built them facing away from the road, so the snow wouldn't block them in. She led them around, and sure enough, a heavy wooden door, snow piled against it. But there. They shouldered it open, and inside was everything. This wasn't some abandoned ruin. It was a maintenance hut, the kind they keep stocked as an emergency shelter through the winter months. There were blankets, a small stove, dry wood, and on the wall, an old radio unit, the kind the road crews used to check in with, wired to a line that ran down the mountain. The old man went straight to it, because of course he did. He'd used one exactly like it years ago, back when he worked these roads. His hands remembered before his head did. He knew the channel. He knew how to raise the crews down in the valley. The kid got the power going. And they gathered around that little radio in the flickering light, 6 cold strangers, and they sent out a call, a real one. Their voices, going out across the mountain to someone who could actually help. And for the first time since that wrong turn, hours and hours ago, somebody on the other end answered. Then came the waiting. The hardest part, in some ways. When the danger's mostly past, but you're still cold and tired, and you just want it to be over. They kept the stove going, kept each other talking. The old man sat by the radio, and every so often a voice would crackle through, telling them the crew was on its way, telling them to hang tight, they were coming. And then Nora saw it first. Of course she did. A light, far down the mountain, through the trees, through the falling snow. Then another beside it, headlights. And above them, a slow amber glow, sweeping back and forth. A snowplow grinding its way up the track toward them, clearing the road as it came. Somebody let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. The kid started waving both arms, even though the plow was still way too far to see him. The local woman put her face in her hands. And the old man just stood very still, watching those lights come. And Nora saw his lips moving, though she couldn't hear what he said. A prayer, maybe, or a promise. They were going to make it. All 6 of them, cold and shaken and hours late, but alive and together and found. The lights kept coming, closer and brighter, and Nora felt the whole day catch up with her all at once. The wrong turn, the rising markers, standing up in that van, the old man's flower. It had all led here, to 6 strangers on a mountainside, watching help finally arrive. But there was one more thing that mattered. One person who still had somewhere to be. The plow got them down before dawn. Warm trucks, hot drinks, people who knew exactly what to do. And the old man, the second they reached the bottom, the second there was a working phone, he made a call. And then he asked, in this quiet, desperate way, if there was any chance at all, of getting to the clinic in time. There was. It was late morning by the time he walked through those doors. His wife had come through the operation just fine. But she'd woken up alone in a strange room. Exactly the thing he'd promised her would never happen. He'd missed the moment. And you'd think that would be the sad part of the story. But it wasn't. Because he got there, snow-soaked and exhausted and hours late. But he got there. And he sat down beside her bed, and he took her hand, and he put that flower in it. The flower he'd carried across a whole valley, through a wrong turn and a rock slide, and a night on a freezing mountain. The paper was crushed. A couple of petals were gone. But it was there. He'd kept his promise. Just a little later than planned. And Nora stood back in the doorway, in her red hoodie, and she didn't go in. Because that moment wasn't hers. It belonged to the 2 of them. She just watched, quietly, with this soft ache in her chest, and then she slipped away and let them have it. That's who she is, if you haven't figured it out by now. Not the hero who saves the day and takes the bow. Just a young woman who pays attention, who notices, who listens when nobody else will. And sometimes, that's exactly what saves everybody.